It's another beautiful Saturday morning, and you're welcome to this week's edition of China Now, where you get the very best of news happening in China and beyond. My name is Makiza Latifa. Let's start the show with China Currents with Lisa. Today, we'll cover highlights such as the new speed record set by Chinese scientists, a Chinese rocket explosion, French car maker Renault parting ways with the EU and opting to partner with China to produce electric cars, as well as China bringing the first soil sample from the back of the moon. Stay tuned as Lisa brings you all the detailed updates and insights you need to know. Over to you, Lisa.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report of what's happening in China. I'm Lisa. In this episode, China brings back the first soil sample from the back of the moon, and every country in the world can get a piece of it, except the United States. A Chinese rocket explodes, but engineers are very happy. Chinese scientists have set a new speed world record. Biden's law opposes China's cranes was met with collective opposition from American entrepreneurs. French car maker Renault parted ways with the EU, opting to partner with China to produce electric cars. The churches of mainland China welcomed a bishop appointed by Pope Francis, and the temples of China's Taiwan welcomed the bombshells. Let's start with an exciting technological achievement for all of us. On the 25th of June, China's lunar probe Chang'e 6 successfully returned and landed on Chinese territory. This means that for the first time, mankind had successfully collected soil sample from the back of the moon. China announced on the 1st of July that it welcomed applications from all countries for research. In response, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, while encouraging U.S. researchers to apply for access to the sample, emphasized that he would work with his lawyers to ensure that the Chinese did not violate the relevant provision of the Wolf Amendment. Bill's statement was very confusing to the Chinese scientists because it was a complete contradiction. The Wolf Amendment he referred to is a law that prevents any space exploration cooperation between the United States and China. Based on this law, which was enacted on the 16th of May 2011, the US imposes virtually all export controls on China-related satellites and rockets. On the same day that the Wolf Amendment was issued, the US-based shuttle Endeavour flew its final mission. Despite the fact that many Chinese scientists were involved in the project, NASA cancelled the press passes it had promised Chinese journalists because of the amendment that has just came into effect less than 24 hours ago. Interestingly, the US government, which has gone to great lengths to prohibit its own scientists from obtaining samples of China's moon soil, is obsessed with convincing China to help them protect the evidence that they were once able to land on the moon. According to Li Hongbo, Deputy Chief Engineer of China Aerospace Science and Technology Group Corporation, after China's lunar exploration project went on smoothly, the US government sent a negotiation team that was very eager to discuss with Chinese experts the issue of how to protect the historical relic of human beings on the moon, following the US flag and footprints left on the moon in 1969 by the US astronauts. Li Hongbo told Chinese media that no one would ask these questions when the US was thought to be the only country in the world capable of landing on the moon. She also found out that before, the US never worried about who should own the minerals on the moon, but after China was able to land on the moon, the US suddenly started to worry about the issue. The US unilaterally passed a law in 2020 called the One Small Step to Protect Human Heritage in Space Act to protect US landing sites on the moon, but the law only applies to a handful of companies that worked with NASA. Under the United Nations Outer Space Treaty, Outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claims of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. Of course, mankind's journey to explore the space has not always been smooth sailing. On the 13th of June, in China's Henan province, a rocket accidentally lifted off during a ground test and exploded after crashing. Fortunately, after the accident, the staff followed the plan and shut down the engine by remote control in time. There were no injuries or fatalities in the accident. The staff also said that the test site was a mine pit surrounded by rocky hills, so even if there were an accident, it would not have a major impact on civilians. The rocket, named Tianlong 3 belongs to a private Chinese space company called Space Pioneer or Tianbing Keji. The engineer said it was not supposed to take off. The reason it did take off without pulling back is because it was indeed too much thrust. Our engine is too good, outperformed too much. This is the largest thrust of China's launch vehicle at this stage in the development process. A power system test run with a total thrust of 820 tons through the 9 sub-engines. The Tianlong 3 rocket was designed against SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket, also a reusable liquid rocket, which has a sea level thrust of about 771 tons. It seems that Chinese space companies have already surpassed their rivals. According to Chinese media outlet Guancha, this rocket is expected to be able to send 30 satellites into space at once. And in addition to Space Pioneer, there are 3 other private space companies in China that are also developing reusable liquid launch vehicles and have completed their maiden flights and engine tests over the past years. In addition to exploring the universe, Chinese scientists are continuing to make inroads in other fields. According to German media Der Spiegel, on June 28th, China has become the world's leading patent power, contributing nearly half of all patent applications filed in 2022. This report is published by the German Association of Research-Based Pharmaceutical Companies. It pointed out that a total of 3.4 million patent applications were approved worldwide in 2022. This is a dramatic increase from 635,000 in 1980, and China was largely responsible for the more than 5-fold increase in the total number of patent applications in the last 40 years. Klaus Mikkelsen, author of the report, added that the China's scientific developments are unprecedented in recent economic history. Since the turn of the millennium, China has built up a science and innovation system reflected in the significant increase in the number of university students in the country. According to the report, from 7 million in 2000, the number of university students enrolled has risen to more than 35 million. In the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sectors, China has already equaled the United States in terms of patent applications. When patents are linked to expenditures, China now has the lowest average expenditure per patent in the world. However, in the EU and the US, the average cost of innovation is becoming increasingly expensive. Although the United States in scientific research is facing challenges from China, but in the views of US President Joe Biden, cheap and high-performance Chinese cranes are more significant threats. During mid-May, the White House announced further tariffs involving about $18 billion of Chinese product, with port cranes shifted from the tariff-free to a tariff rate of 25%. On the 1st of July, this policy finally led to a number of US port entrepreneurs' collective opposition. American Association of Port Authority President Carrie Davis said the tariffs on Chinese cranes will only have a negative impact, which will seriously affect port efficiency and capacity, exacerbate supply chain tension, which will lead to an increase in consumer cost of living, and the US economy will be further weakened. The letter pointed out that 7 domestic US ports have contracted to purchase at least 35 Chinese-made cranes. At an average price of $15 million per unit, the tax hike will add an additional $131 million in cost to the US port operators when it hit the ground. which means the port in question will either have to abandon their expansion plans or shrink the scale of their business. Barbara Melvin, the CEO of the South Carolina port, said they are trying to improve their competitiveness with Mexican and Canadian rivals, and this additional cost will lead to longer waiting time for container ships and longer loading and unloading times. Although Biden believed that the U.S. can produce its own new harbor cranes to replace, Paul Anderson, the former federal maritime commissioner, said the crane totally made in the United States is unlikely to be available soon, and many of the parts and components of the European manufacturers are also purchased from China and Russia. According to President Biden's firm attitude, these products will still be subject to the new tariff policy. With regards to the U.S. government's tariff policy, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning has pointed out that the generalization of the concept of national security, the abuse of state power, the unreasonable suppression of Chinese products and enterprises, and the instrumental and weaponization of economic and trade issues will only exacerbate the security risk of the global supply chain and detriment the U.S. itself. Otherwise, the century-old French automobile company is clearly more efficient in its approach than the US port companies that are still suffering under Biden's wisdom. While the European Union has raised tariffs on Chinese electric cars, on the 2nd of July, Renault announced that it would partner with a Chinese company for mass production. Renault's Chinese partner is called Ningde Shidai, or CATL, one of China's largest EV battery producers and BYD's designated supplier. These batteries from the Chinese companies will eventually be installed in 590,000 French electric cars that will jam all the streets of the European nation. On the eve of this year's Shanghai Auto Expo, Renault Group CEO Luca Di Meo specifically emphasized that it is essential to establish partnership with Chinese companies, and Renault cannot afford to give up the opportunity to work with an ecosystem that includes a battery super factory, top-notch engineering, and raw material refining capabilities. According to the EU's preliminary program of raising tariffs on China's EV, Renault's Chinese partner will be subject to a 21% tariff increase, and Renault, which is highly dependent on export, will naturally bear the brunt of the impact. In Europe's survey on China's EV, Meo said completely closed door to China will be the worst response. He believes that even though Europe wants to protect its own market, but they also have to continue to learn from the industry's leading generation of China. European CEOs are not the only group who want to keep in touch with China, but also Pope Francis. And on the 12th of June, it recognized Yang Yongqiang as the new bishop of the diocese in China's Zhejiang province, and the ceremony was successfully held on the 27th. The basis for cooperation on this bishop appointment, which is jointly recognized by China and the Vatican, stems from a provisional agreement signed in 2018, which stipulates that the Chinese government has the right to appoint bishops on its own in advance consultation with the Vatican. While this agreement began as a provisional one, it has been renewed in 2020 and 2022, during which time China and the Vatican have jointly appointed 6 bishops in total. This year is the 100th anniversary of the first Chinese Bishops' Conference held in Shanghai. At the end of Francis' weekly audience in St. Peter's Square on June 19th, he said, "This also makes me think about the beloved Chinese people. Let us always pray for this noble and very courageous people who have such a beautiful culture." While this continuing provisional agreement is clearly good for the spread of the gospel, the United States, which prints "In God We Trust" on its banknotes, doesn't seem to be happy about it. In 2020, former President Donald Trump sent Pompeo to the Vatican to try to prevent China and the Vatican from signing this agreement. According to official Chinese statistics, now there are 2,500 churches, 3,500 mosques, and 3,300 Buddhist temples in China. These relics and religious sites in mainland China have always received full respect from the local council, and it is because of this that Taiwan's military had decided to commandeer the temples as armories for storing munitions to ensure that these explosives will never be bombed by the mainland China. According to the revelation of the Taiwan media United Daily News, on the 17th of June, at least 3 temples have received documents from the Taiwan military claiming that in the case of a conflict, they would commandeer the temples to store ammunition. According to photo released by several Taiwan media outlets, the document stamped with the seal of a Taiwan army colonel named Xu. In addition to the temples, some residential buildings have been similarly commandeered. The Taiwan military claimed that this was a program implemented over many years to preserve combat power. Apparently, they also realized that the mainland China's People's Liberation Army would never bomb religious buildings and civilian areas. The Taiwanese media reported concerns that, according to the U.S. military in the Gulf War, civilian buildings would be legitimate targets as military positions for storing munitions. This information has once again triggered criticism by the Chinese public. Some netizens questioned the Taiwanese military as to why it only commandeered Buddhist temples but not churches and mosques. Does this indicate that the Taiwan military is discriminating against Buddhists? As of now, the Taiwan's military has not responded positively to this question. And that is all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Current. If you have any thoughts and comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below. And we look forward to hearing from you and see you again next time.
Thank you, Lisa. Next on the show is the Thinkers Forum, where our scholars and thinkers share their insights on various issues happening around the globe. Let me give a bit of background to the topic, which will be discussed in detail by our first speaker. Now, in March 2024, former President of the United Nations Security Council, Mr. Kishore Mahbubani, and the Director of the Asia Society's Center on U.S China Relations, Mr. Orville Schell, engaged in a debate on U.S China relations in New York City, USA. Here's an interview with Mr. Mahbubani following the debate to gain further insights.
What power with great power pretensions adopts wolf warrior diplomacy, and why? What's going on here? How is that in the advantage of anybody, much less China?
12% of the world's population lives in the West, and 88% of the world's population lives outside the West. And let me make one point very clearly and very boldly at the very beginning. How the 12% views China is not how the 88% views China.
So I think whether we like it or not, we have to pay attention to the points that Orville Schell makes, because he speaks, what he speaks represents the views of many Americans. And at the same time, I think the views of Mr. Schell and people like him in the United States surprisingly also show a deep ignorance of China. And I say surprising because certainly in the case of Mr. Orville Schell, he's a very good scholar. He's written lots of books, and he cannot say that he's not knowledgeable about China. He is very knowledgeable about China, certainly Chinese history. But I suspect that his portrayal of contemporary China tends to be distorted by Western perspectives. And to explain what I mean by that, the West continues to believe that there's only one way for societies to develop, that they all have to become carbon copies of Western liberal democratic societies. And of course, this is not a secret, because as you know, Francis Fukuyama said this in his famous essay, The End of History, and his essay was accepted by all Western intellectuals, and they all thought all societies must conform and become like Western liberal democratic societies. And what's sad about that is that the Western intellectuals cannot accept the reality that 200 years of Western domination of world history is over. Is over. And now you're going to live in a world which doesn't just have one successful civilization, Western civilization, as we had in the 19th century and 20th century. In the 21st century, there'll be many successful civilizations, and many Asian civilizations will come back. And certainly these civilizations, whether Indian or Islamic or Chinese, will grow and change and develop on the basis of modern influences, on the basis of new influences from outside, but also on the basis of their own historical and cultural traditions. Certainly in China, with a 4,000, 5,000 year history, is not going to become a carbon copy or a replica of a Western liberal society. Why should it? It should develop according to the basis of its own culture and history and tradition. But a simple idea like this alone is unacceptable to Western intellectuals. And it shows that Western intellectuals, even though they claim that they have liberal, open minds, in reality, they actually have closed minds because they can only see everything within a small Western box. And what is not inside the Western box, they cannot see, which is stunning. And I say this as someone who spent all my life studying Western thought, Western culture, and I always thought that the Western tradition should be one of having open minds to new possibilities. But certainly when it comes to China, the Western mind has become closed. And sadly, I don't see it opening up in the near future. I wish I had some good news for you. Unfortunately, on U.S. China relations, I have no good news for you. I only have bad news for you that most Western policymakers share the same narrow, jaundiced view of China. And indeed, many of the policymakers actually have harsher views on China. I mean, as you know, there was recently an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs by two people who had relatively senior roles. Matt Pottinger, who was a senior official on China in the Trump administration, Mike Gallagher, a congressman who was chairman of the Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Communist Party of China. And these are very senior people, but they have come out with an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs saying that no, you mustn't just mustn't focus on engagement with China. You must focus not just on competition with China, you must focus on defeating China. That's what they're saying. So, I mean, in so doing, they were clearly showing their very negative attitude. And of course, attitudes like theirs trouble not just people in China, but trouble people certainly in the rest of the world, in Southeast Asia, who are asking, how does that help the United States? What are you trying to do by defeating China? You know, it doesn't make sense. And so it's very important that the rest of the world now must speak out in a much louder and a much clearer fashion to say to US and China that, hey, before you engage in a big contest, please consider the implications for the rest of the world. It's not going to be just disruptive for Americans and Chinese. It's going to be disruptive also for countries of Southeast Asia, for example. So we in Southeast Asia should speak out more loudly and say, hey, please reconsider what you're doing. So far, these voices have not been loud enough, but I hope that in my case, by speaking out, I'll encourage others to speak out and therefore hopefully create a more tenable situation for the rest of for the other countries in the world. And so my goal, therefore, is to try and help the West out by trying to explain to them that they completely misunderstand China. As you know, the biggest insight that Henry Kissinger gave to me after a one-on-one lunch I had with him in March 2018 was that the United States doesn't have a grand strategy. In fact, has not worked out any kind of comprehensive strategy before launching its geopolitical contests against China. That's clearly very unwise. And by the way, Henry Kissinger has also emphasized, both to me and in his book on China, that by contrast, China does have a long-term strategy. But if you also want proof that the United States doesn't have a strategy, all you have to do is ask the question, which I keep asking. Before you can formulate a strategy, you must first of all say, what is your goal? What is the goal of your strategy? Is your goal to stop the economic growth of China? It cannot be done. Is your goal to overthrow the Communist Party of China? It cannot be done. Is your goal, for example, to isolate China? It cannot be done. In fact, China does more trade with the rest of the world than the United States does. And so the United States should ask itself, what is a realistic goal when it comes to dealing with China? And these are the sort of hard questions that great strategic minds like Henry Kissinger would ask, which unfortunately very few or almost no one in the United States is asking, because the United States no longer has great strategic minds like Henry Kissinger, sadly.
Let's now continue with the second part of the Thinkers Forum.
Neoliberalism, roughly from the 1970s to perhaps 2015, or some rough time like that, 30, 40, 45 years, that policy, neoliberalism, often referred to as globalization, was a policy in which the governments of Western Europe and North America and Japan eagerly supported a global free trade, no tariffs, minimum government intervention in the economy, support for corporations that relocated their business out of the country, internationalization. Governments told the people, you will be better off with free trade. Your standard of living will rise. Your job opportunities will improve. This was incorrect. It was bad economics then, but it was a very good rationale for what corporations in the West wanted to do. They wanted to go to China, India, Brazil, and so on to take advantage of the low wages and the growing market. And in order to do that, they had to overcome the nationalism that was still a strong tendency in these countries. So what happened was the neoliberal promise turned out to be half true, half false. The true part is it made huge profits. It was a successful program for increasing the profits of Western corporations. They could pay much lower wages in China and India than they paid where they came from. And they had the growing Chinese market and the growing Asian market. And so they had tremendous profits. That's why you saw a boom in the stock market in the West, because it was the only institution where you could see the profits producing rising wealth. But I like to remind people that in the United States, the richest 10% of our people own 80% of the shares on the stock market. So successful profiteering is only good for the top 10%, not for the masses. Meanwhile, for the masses, it was very bad. Millions of jobs working in manufacturing disappeared in the United States. Whole states out of the 50 states in the United States, whole states basically collapsed economically. Their industries disappeared, their jobs disappeared, their unions lost membership. They were forced to become low-wage service economies that they had not been before. It has been a trauma, a political, ideological trauma. And over those 40 years, I'll give you one example. In 1970, presidents from around the world, if they visited the United States, were taken to the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit was the center of the automobile industry in this country. Ford, General Motors, all of that. And it was a booming city. It had 2 million, which was very big then, 2 million people, a very successful labor union, the United Auto Workers, and all of that. Today, Detroit is a disaster. Its population has dropped from 2 million in 1970 to 700,000 today. That means that more than half the people in that powerful, successful city are gone. It is now a city 1/3 of abandoned housing. No one lives there. No one can afford to live there because there are no jobs. So that's an extreme example. But other large cities in the United States, Cleveland, Wilmington, Delaware, parts of Chicago have similar, Buffalo, New York, have similar histories. And it is, for the mass of people, it has been a very difficult time. And so they are the losers of neoliberalism, but they are also the vast majority. And it was only a matter of time before an opportunistic politician would begin to see opportunity in speaking to the millions of people who had been hurt by neoliberalism because it was a boon for the profiteers, but not for the mass of people. That's our politics today. Mr. Trump simply rides on the wave of hostility to what has happened to the United States.
We are now making it clear to China that after years of targeting our industries and stealing our intellectual property, the theft of American jobs and wealth has come to an end.
They don't understand, because very few people teach it here, how to understand the world economy shifting. What they know is that their position in large parts of the United States are gone. The future for their children is not looking good. The prices, we've had an inflation here. The cost of higher education is out of reach. You cannot get a college education without taking on huge amounts of personal debt, you or your parents or your family. It's a whole new world here. And for the mass of the working class, not a good one. So what we have is a massive turning away from neoliberalism and globalization, except at the level of big business. Our corporate sector remains interested in neoliberalism and globalization because they have invested huge amounts of money in China, for example, in India and Brazil. They don't want to lose those investments. That's very important to them. So they support the Democratic Party and Mr. Biden, hoping to keep that. But the mass of the working class is not supportive of this kind of program, and they are turning more and more nationalistic. Even Mr. Biden has had to impose tariffs, for example. Mr. Trump began it between 2016 and 2020, and Mr. Biden, who wanted to get rid of it, could not. he had to stay in power, he had to become at least publicly nationalistic, put heavy tariffs against, above all, China. Millions of Americans who have been the losers of neoliberal globalization for decades. They are very unhappy. And the political leaders in the United States, desperate not to be blamed for all of this, have needed to come up with scapegoats. They have needed to come up with an explanation for the mass of people that blames somebody other than the corporations and the political apparatus that they own in this country. So they've come up with two major scapegoats. One of them is immigration. They have gotten Americans to believe that the immigrants, particularly those that come from the South, come up through Mexico into the United States, that they are the cause of the problems of the American working class. They have spent enormous amounts of time and energy and lots of money trying to make that case. And they've had to spend money and time because the case is ridiculous and silly. The United States is an advanced economy of 330 million people. The total number of undocumented immigrants in the United States is maybe 10 million, okay? 10 million immigrants, 330 million Americans. There is no explanation of the difficulty for the economy as a whole that can be blamed on those 10 million people, especially when you remember they are among the poorest people in the world, these immigrants. They come with nothing. They are men, women, and children with no money, barely able to put a shirt on their body to keep warm, okay? So this is outrageous, but it's the number one scapegoat. The number two scapegoat is China. And here you should understand also American political history. There are still many people who don't understand that the Cold War with the USSR is over. They still think of socialism and communism as frightening, foreign, evil phenomena. They do. And so because China is led by a communist party, it's very easy politically in the United States to say that China is an enemy. The real issue is the competition. Americans are now dealing with the fact that the Chinese produce the highest quality electric vehicle at the lowest price. Most Americans believe that the economic competition coming from China is intended to displace the dominant position of the world so that it's no longer American, it becomes Chinese. It's an evil plot to rule the world. This is how it is explained. And all kinds of people, including significant numbers of intellectuals, believe this. They don't know much about China. They don't know much about the history. They barely understand what happened in 1949 and the Civil War and the defeat of Chiang Kai-shek and all of it. They don't know much of that. Their understanding is that China is the evil doer. So, for example, they like to be told that the Chinese stole the technology from the West. The idea that American corporations exchanged technology for cheap labor and market access, which is what happened, they don't want that because that says that the corporations, with the support of the government, went to China, which is what happened. But they don't want that story. They want to be able to blame the Chinese. You could see it with President Trump. For the 4 years of his presidency, he explained that the tariffs were a punishment of the misbehavior of the Chinese. And he told the American people the Chinese would have to pay those tariffs. But of course, as a professor of economics, I had to explain to my students that tariffs are not paid by the Chinese. They're paid by Americans when they import. It's a tax called a tariff put on you by the American government. My students looked at me. They understood what I was telling them, but they had a really hard time because their president was telling them that the evil, bad Chinese are being punished because this story is very important so that the anger built up by 40 years of neoliberal globalization is focused on the Chinese and on immigrants. And the corporate leaders of America like that because they don't want to be the ones that get blamed. They don't. And so it's very helpful to them to blame immigrants and to blame the Chinese, even though they don't want to lose the Chinese connection. That issue, that's the issue here in the United States. Will we develop a political force that can successfully explain to the American working class what their problem is? Or will we continue to be governed by a Republican Party that blames immigrants more than Chinese, and a Democratic Party that blames Chinese more than immigrants? But both of them are perfectly happy to scapegoat both of them. And the Democrats add Russia, and the Republicans a little less on Russia, a little more on China. But don't be fooled by the details. And if you understand that, you won't be confused by the bizarre statements our politicians make or the political theater that they put on display. The reality is American capitalism is no longer the dominant capitalism in the world. It has to face that. The whole rest of the world is adjusting to that fact. China has to make a huge decision. The British Empire is over. The American Empire is declining. Will we now see a Chinese empire? Or will the Chinese be new and different in world history and say no more empires? Not Britain, not Rome, not Greece, not the United States, and not China. When Xi Jinping says, I want to create a multipolar world, this opens a whole new possibility. Remember, in the 20th century, the West tried the League of Nations. After World War II, the world tried the United Nations, but they did not succeed. The question is, might the Chinese lead the world into a genuinely multipolar world? I hope so.
And that's all for the show today. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to send in your comments, thoughts, feedback, and suggestions through the email provided below. My name is Makiza Latifa, and I will see you same time next week.